Okay, so let's get underway. Welcome, everyone who's joined us again for another Massachusetts Peace Action, and this time a Raytheon anti-war campaign webinar. Tonight, we're going to be talking with Jeremy Kuzmarov, who's the managing editor of Covert Action magazine. And we're particularly interested to talk to Jeremy tonight because he's just recently written an article on our current defense secretary, former General Lloyd Austin, who's not only a former general in the United States Army, but also a former member of the Raytheon Technologies Board of Directors. And we're going to explore the conflict of interest that is natural when someone who steps off the board of a major weapons maker and is now setting policy as Secretary of Defense. So thanks to everyone who's joined us tonight. This webinar is co-sponsored by Massachusetts Peace Action as well as the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign. And we're going to be talking about Lloyd Austin, who is the Secretary not only of Defense, but of the defense industry. And that's a quote that we borrowed from Bill Hartung, who's a quote that we use quite often. So our guest tonight is Jeremy Kuzmarov, who's managing editor of Covert Action magazine, a publication founded in the late 70s in 1978. It was founded by critics of the CIA, including former agency officials. Jeremy is the author of 4 books on U.S. foreign policy, including The Russians Are Coming Again, the first Cold War as Tragedy, the second as Farce, and he is also the author of Obama's Ending Wars, Fronting the Foreign Policy of the Permanent Warfare State. So welcome, Jeremy. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So Jeremy, just to start us off, can you describe the article that I mentioned focusing on Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and the conflict of interest of him setting policy and coming straight from Raytheon Technologies?
Yeah, and the article was only written a couple of weeks ago, and already because since his confirmation in January, Raytheon Corporation has received, well, the time of the writing, which was April 19th, it had received 2.36 billion in government contracts. And I look because the Defense Department does put out every day the contracts. And I think yesterday they gave another $500 million contract to, and I was looking 500,000, no, 500 million to Raytheon. So the number appears now to be, it's approaching 3 billion, if it's not already eclipsed $3 billion in just several months. And, Austin had been on the board of Raytheon. And I mean, this is just an example of the, I mean, it's legal, but it's legal corruption of American politics. And the taxpayer is just financing these huge, world's leading arms manufacturers who, Raytheon, as most people here probably know, because it's a well-informed audience, manufactured cluster bombs that were used to kill children in Yemen. And they manufactured a lot of the technology that's been used, very sophisticated high-tech weapon systems and precision weapons that are used in the war, for years now in Afghanistan and Iraq, and going back to Vietnam. I mean, it has a long history, going back to the Vietnam War, where it was manufacturing some of the missiles, and I think had been a target of anti-war activists in the Vietnam era. So it's a shame that American taxpayers are just financing this huge military arms merchant. They used to call them merchants of death, and I think we need to reinvoke that language. And I know you guys are doing your part to try and raise awareness and hinder their operations or counter recruitment in the schools, and because this is not functioning democracy, and this is not humane. That so many domestic problems. That money could be well used in our school system. I mean, I live in Oklahoma, and the school system is terrible here. The public schools, even before the pandemic, they had to go to a 4-day school day in some districts because of underfunding, and the teachers are grossly underpaid, and there were strikes 2 years ago, and the legislature basically did nothing. So this is shameful, and Austin just epitomizes that revolving door. And he's moving from the board, from the army. I mean, he had a long army career, and that's the other disturbing thing about his appointment, is that the secretary. I mean, it's supposed to be the Defense Department, not the war. They did at one point call it the War Department, but they were civilian appointees to head the Pentagon. And this is breaking norm by appointing a career military officer who played a key role in the second Iraq War, which is one of the least transparent wars in American history. There was no declaration of war. There was no approval of Congress. There had already been troops there. I think Obama administration invoked the war on terror as justification in the previous agreements, as that he didn't actually have to get anything passed through Congress for the U.S. to escalate the war and the bombing. And Austin played a huge role in that. And they broke the protocol of appointing civilian to appoint him as the head of the Defense Department. And what I found just looking at the statements is he's going around the world promoting more war and more military escalation and more arms sales to regime like in Ukraine and Afghanistan. He's wanting to prolong the war, and wherever he goes, he goes to Israel. And I mean, already the U.S. provides record levels of military aid to Israel, and human rights reports have come out with strong condemnation of Israeli policy to occupied territory. And there's no stipulations on the military aid the U.S. provides. It's a record level and unprecedented in history that one country gives 3.8 billion in military aid to another country, and he goes there and says we're going to give you more weapons, and and he's just framing all these conflicts in a way that justifies giving them more weapons. And so he's using his position to advance more wars and enrich the company that served him very well and made him a lot of money. And they paid him a big settlement. Once he was appointed to the Defense Department, he got a lot of money from Raytheon. He recused himself from the board, but they paid him off, and he just gets richer and richer, and the company gets richer and richer, and people die around the world, and Americans are getting screwed too, because our money is just going to enrich this corporation, and our schools are failing in a lot of parts, and on and on. So
yeah, and I'm particularly interested in what you found in your article. Is I believe the number that you listed is some $2.3 billion has already been awarded in contracts to Raytheon just in under 4 months of the Biden administration. Now, as you said in your article as well, during his confirmation hearing, General Austin, now Secretary of Defense Austin, said that he would recuse himself from decisions involving his former employee, at least for a given amount of time, much longer than 4 months. So how is it that they are denying that there is a conflict of interest there? How is he claiming that he's maintaining his promise of recusing himself while his former employer gets billions of dollars in U.S. contracts?
yeah, well, and just to add, there's a good quote in the article. Mark Pocan, a Democrat from Wisconsin, said, American national security should not be defined by the bottom lines of Boeing, General Dynamics, and Raytheon. And that's exactly what's happening. And there's almost no pushback. Like your Senator, Elizabeth Warren did confront Austin one of the hearing, but then she ended up voting for his confirmation. And she's supposedly this great liberal. So there's almost nobody in the political system standing up to this. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, how, yeah, I don't know. He's not on the board anymore, and they paid him like they paid him over $1 million to leave. So he just gets more money, and he can claim he's not giving them any special favors in these contracts. And I mean, it is true. If you look at the daily reports, these companies are also getting huge, General Dynamics and Boeing, and some of these other companies are Lockheed Martin are also raking it in. So he may not necessarily be favoring them on particular deal, given that he is also doing it to these other companies. So it just shows the obscene levels of money that are going into these weapons makers. And you wonder why these forever wars go on when most of the public does not support them. And they serve no benefit to anybody except these companies. They tear up those countries, they destabilize them. Uh, and it's just obscene what's going on here, and more people have to stand up, like you guys are doing.
Well, thanks. You talked about breaking the norms of having a civilian in charge of the military. Of course, we know, and you mentioned our senator here in Massachusetts, Senator Elizabeth Warren. And I remember in the early days of the Trump administration, when he appointed General James Mattis, to be Defense Secretary. She was adamantly opposed to breaking that norm, that we have a civilian as Pentagon chief. And now, just in the matter of 4 years, a new president of a different party is also appointing someone who has not. I believe the original amount of time was you need to be 7 years removed from active service in the military. And of course, General Austin was only 4 years removed from that role. So both houses of Congress had to pass a waiver. And when they did so, Senator Warren ended up voting in favor of the confirmation. Can you talk a little bit about that disconnect?
Well, yeah, and that's a disappointing thing we see in American politics, that these supposedly liberal figures end up kind of rubber stamping, this system that is antithetical to functioning democracy, and really, disturbing way that American politics has evolved. A huge escalation of what Dwight Eisenhower warned about years ago. And you would think, you would count on a Warren, you would think that there would be liberal figures, who would stand up against this. But unfortunately, often, partisan politics becomes so central that figures like Warren or Sanders sometimes toe the Democratic Party line. And they did it on wars like Libya, which was a terrible war, almost as bad as Iraq, and it's caused a horrible disaster for the Libyan population. And yet a lot of liberal figures were supporting it because it was under the Obama administration, liberals who opposed the original Iraq war in 2003. So I think, peace groups and people, progressive minded people have to get beyond the shackles of partisan politics sometimes. And as bad as the Republicans may be on domestic policies, at times, one can't just support Democratic presidents or administrations if they're doing things that are just as bad as the Republicans. And unfortunately, in foreign policy, you have a situation where the Democrats are often a little different from Republicans in foreign policy. So, and then you'd have to look at where Warren gets some of her money, because even Sanders took in a lot of money from the Defense Department. He's not always if you talk to activists in Vermont, he's done some very bad things involving the F-35. And, he was very quick to have the peace activists arrested when they were protesting the F-35 production in Vermont. And Sanders had supported the drone war in Afghanistan and Libya. And if you look at his financing, he's taken some money, from these contractors as well. And I mean, I don't know as much. You may know more about Warren and where she gets her money, but sometimes when you look into the liberal figures, you find they're weak on these core issues of war and peace or the military complex, because they are taking some money from big military contractors, or they represent districts where there is a lot of military production. So it's a real systemic problem in American politics, and peace groups have to confront this problem of campaign financing and the influence that these companies have in buying off even liberal politicians.
I think you're absolutely right there, Jeremy. We had Stephen Semler on earlier this week talking about the relationship between campaigns financed by these so-called defense weapons manufacturers, let's call them what they are, and the direct correlation between the amount of money taken in campaign donations and the likelihood that they would vote for an increased military budget. And he found very clearly that if you take above a certain threshold, then it is far more likely that you'll vote for an ever expanding Pentagon budget. And that really backs up what seems like common sense. Now, another norm that was broken, not just putting generals in charge of the Pentagon, but directly putting figures in who come from the defense industry. I think someone noted it in the chat that after leaving the Pentagon, Secretary Jim Mattis went right back to General Dynamics. Also a major weapons producer, making weapons that have been used on the people of Yemen, which is of direct concern to us at the Raytheon anti-war campaign. But also maybe even a clearer continuation of policy from the Trump administration to the Biden administration is favoring Raytheon. I'm sure, as most people on this call already know, one of the last defense secretaries under Trump was, of course, Mark Esper, who before becoming Secretary of the Army, I believe first in the Trump administration, served as the head of governmental relations for Raytheon. So the Raytheon company's top lobbyist. And very famously, Donald Trump was interviewed on 60 Minutes after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and asked by Leslie Stahl, I believe, whether they would cut off arms sales and to Saudi Arabia as punishment for the murder of Khashoggi. And Donald Trump clearly said, the last thing I want to do is hurt jobs for companies like Boeing, Lockheed, and Raytheon. These political figures would have us believe that they are completely different, that Donald Trump has nothing in common with Joe Biden, and yet they seem to draw a lot of personnel from the same source. What's your reaction to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's a serious problem in American politics where it's not a government for the people as the Constitution was set up, as the founding fathers, not that they were perfect people, but they did envision a government for the people. And instead we have a government for Raytheon and they, should be called after World War I, the term became popular merchants of death. And there was an I committee was set up, to investigate the war profiteers in World War I, corporation like DuPont and Winchester Arms Company and J.P. Morgan. and it condemned their action. And not the senator had called for the nationalization of the arms industry. And I think the peace movement should become bold and call out these companies as merchants of death. And there should be demand either for the nationalization of the industry, also, maybe a program of reconversion had been on the table in the Vietnam era, where peace groups were developing plans to reconvert these defense plants and retrain the workers. So that, I mean, they have tremendous technological capability. And, Raytheon itself, a lot of these companies, they actually produce a lot of amazing products but the war contracting is their biggest business, but they employ some very skilled engineers and, I mean, scientists, in the Boston area have such amazing schools like MIT where they're recruiting people. And I think a lot of these people would like to do something positive with their abilities. And so I think the peace movement should try and work even within the scientific community and the scientists who don't want to work in weapons to develop a program of reconversion and place the pressure so that these companies would be forced to manufacture goods that are needed for the civilian economy. And there's so many needs. I mean, if you look at how China is so advanced as far as its high-speed rail, I mean, that's something we should be, our engineers should be producing and working to develop efficient high-speed rail. And, there are many environmental problems that we need scientists to work on. So I think that, seeing how this system has evolved and how these war corporations dominate, I think the peace movement urgently should bring back those efforts to reconvert and force these companies to move away from war production. And that way their lobbying efforts will be in another direction instead of for more wars and more propaganda to create fear about Russia or China that's misleading. If they're producing high-speed rail, then they would want to condition the public differently. It wouldn't be necessary to create those artificial threats.
Yeah, one of the things that that caught my eye about your article is you actually featured a photo of one of the Raytheon anti-war campaign demonstrations where we were trying to do just that. And this is something that we've done probably over a dozen times now at schools like Northeastern and MIT. I think the photo you used was outside of UMass Lowell. Doing demonstrations outside of career fairs where Raytheon is trying to recruit young engineers to come and work for them and begin their careers designing new weapons. And that is an argument that we've made to the students, and I know that it does work to let them know that they should really be using their expertise and their brain power to build the infrastructure of the 21st century, to fight climate change, to build things like high-speed rail, and not to contribute to more destruction in the Middle East, for instance. But I'm glad that you raised the issue of China. We see that as particularly threatening to world peace. That China is being used, being put up as an enemy of the United States to really drive defense spending higher and higher for the next generation. And an article that you published just today focused on the possibility that Dan Ellsberg, who I think is known to everyone on this call, man who heroically released the Pentagon Papers, that he is considering making another release around some documents involving war planning in part against China and for the security regarding the security of Taiwan. Can you talk a little bit about that article?
Sure. Yeah, and I think we're seeing a lot of rhetoric against China that's creating xenophobia. There have been these attacks on Asian people around the United States now, and they're just creating this again artificial threat of China. I mean, China is not an aggressive power militarily. China has been working to expand its economy, and I mean, it has evolved into a powerful economy. And in that sense, it's threatening to supersede the United States economically. But China has a huge population, and that really the United States could still flourish economically if China's strong economically. So there's no threat there at all. They're making a threat out of nothing, and it's the United States that is encircling China militarily with ships in the South China Sea, as ratchet up military aid to India, China's historical adversary, and huge arms sale to Taiwan. And Taiwan historically was part of China. It was colonized by the Japanese, and then after the Chinese Civil War, the United States was supporting Chiang Kai-shek, who lost to the Maoists, and he fled to Taiwan, and the CIA helped set him up in Taiwan. And it was a very corrupt regime, and they also massacred a lot of Taiwanese. So China feel that Taiwan belongs as part of China, and I think they're adamant that they will reincorporate Taiwan by 2049, the 100-year anniversary of the Chinese Revolution. But the United States, is bent on opposing China's influence there, and defending Taiwan. And that gets back to the Ellsberg, because how far will they go to prevent China from getting? That's the danger. And he was a nuclear planner in the 50s, and he said that, and he has these documents that he talked about at this conference, where the documents show that they're ready to use nuclear weapons, and they would destroy Taiwan to save it at that time from takeover by communist China. And there's a real danger, the same thing today. He said those discussions are going on again today, and they may be willing to destroy Taiwan to prevent China from over, as it feels it has the right to. And that might strengthen China's economy further, and the U.S. has to be the top dog, and they can't allow this to go to such extreme levels. And Ellsberg referred to, because an American general, Richard, came out and said that we have to, basically saying we might have to respond to Russia and China with war, and like nuclear war is not off the table or something like that. And Ellsberg brought that up, and he said, a statement like that sounds to be insane. He basically advocating for nuclear war, and he fears that U.S. government leaders are, he used the word criminally insane, and they would actually go forward with these plans that would cause millions and millions of deaths. And when he was in the Pentagon, he had a document that's in his book where they had a plan to kill 200 million people through a nuclear attack. And he said, these, and he knew them, and he said he socialized with them, and some were actually pretty nice people that he enjoyed interacting with, but he thought that they were crazy. They would actually go through with these plans. And they were, extreme nationalists, that any sign that the U.S. is losing some power, and they would go to that extreme.
Yeah, we actually recently were honored to have Dan Ellsberg on for a talk. I want to say it was last month, or at most 2 months ago, on his book Doomsday Machine, where he talked about his role as a nuclear war planner for the Rand Corporation, and talking about how how disturbed he was at seeing these documents that showed that they were willing to carry out plans in the event of a war with Russia or China, to go to war with both and kill hundreds of millions of people. I guess what I found most striking about that is that was well before they understood the ramifications and consequences of nuclear winter. So, despite the fact that they were willing to accept hundreds of millions of deaths, the plans that they were talking about probably would have killed billions and destroyed human civilization as we know it. So I'm very concerned to hear that Dan Ellsberg thinks that those are the kind of conversations that are going on at the Pentagon right now. I know you've written quite a bit about the threat of war between the U.S. And China. I'm wondering what your reaction is to the Biden administration's characterization of U.S.-Chinese relations. It's something that he brought up a lot in his recent, I guess not State of the Union, but joint address before Congress.
Yeah, unfortunately, guess it was predictable. We see a lot of continuity, and from the Trump administration. I mean, Trump's of his comments were ridiculous. With his kung flu and very offensive type comments Trump would make, and Biden's not quite as crude as Trump is, but he's promoting very strong anti-China rhetoric and pushing for very aggressive and dangerous and reckless policies that Ellsberg sees as criminally insane. And they're also the U.S. sent 2 naval ships into the Black Sea, accompanying Tony Blinken's visit to Ukraine, and that's a very strong signal of aggression towards Russia. So I think the Biden administration is really ratcheting up the Cold War with both Russia and China, and it could lead in very dangerous direction. People are predicting there could be a war with China in the next 3 or 5 years. And I think the Pentagon made the calculation. It gets back to our discussion about the problem when you have companies like Raytheon dictating American policy and needing an enemy. The war on terror is winding down, has lost its legitimacy. The public is not supporting war in Afghanistan anymore. It's embarrassment what went on in Yemen. So they have to turn now to great power rivalry and reorient. And Obama started with a pivot to Asia. I think was should have received a lot of more criticism and protest, because he started this pivot to Asia when Nixon had opened U.S. relations with China, and the U.S. had good relations with China. I mean, there were certain problems, and of course there are certain levels of exploitation when companies like Walmart go over there, and there's poor labor standards, and there's grounds to criticize certain things, but I don't think the right approach is sending all these naval vessels into the South China Sea and ramping up the U.S. military base network in Southeast Asia and encircling China that way, and again ratcheting up arms to Taiwan and India. And that's what Obama was doing as starting this process. Trump continued it, and it's continuing now in the Biden administration. And the sad thing is that Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, was promoting a win-win policy, and he even gave a speech and promoted this to U.S. Diplomats, that we should go for win-win. We have our interests, you have your interests. There's no reason they can't be compatible. China's main interests are economic, expanding its economy, establishing the One Belt, One Road. It's not a very militaristic or aggressive country. They haven't invaded other countries in decades. So there's no reason the U.S. public should be pushing for this win-win approach, where the U.S. looks out for its economic interests and follows a win-win, instead of seeing China as the enemy and demonizing Chinese people and demonizing China and playing up the human rights abuses. Well, yeah, China's government's not perfect in human rights, but the American government is not perfect. There's an article in the New York Times today about a huge number of prisoners died of COVID, and the numbers that were profiled in this article had already had their sentences run out. For some reason, they were still in jail, or they were on minor drug offenses, and they were just left to die in these COVID-infested prisons. And as we know, the American criminal justice system is riven with abuses and racial profiling the police and these police shootings. and then look at American policy in Afghanistan and all the children that were killed from the bombing, or Yemen. So, I mean, it's ridiculous for the United States to be lecturing China on human rights. And then, with the Uyghurs, there are some excesses of Chinese policy, but there's claims that are not founded of genocide and cotton, slavery in the cotton fields, and that's actually not substantiated. So there's an exaggeration of the Chinese human rights abuses that's designed to mobilize the public against China. And it's the politicization and weaponization of human rights. And we've seen that before with Saddam Hussein was this alleged monster who we had to remove, and Gaddafi was a monster and carried out mass rapes. That was actually false, and was committing genocide, which was false. So it's a method of propaganda that we're seeing, and it may be designed to condition and mobilize the people for war. And the same thing has happened for the last 8 years with Russia. We've heard nonstop stories of Russian aggression and election interference, and half the story, most propaganda, there may be some truth, maybe few of the stories are true, but probably most of them are not true, and most are not proven. And the US is pursuing, the encirclement of Russia, and has intervened in Ukraine on their border with a coup, and Belarus. And that's threatening from a Russian point of view. And so this is what we're seeing now. It's just continuing. Whoever's in power in Washington really doesn't matter. It's more these structural forces driving this permanent warfare, and it's very dangerous. Russia has 600 nuclear weapons, so why provoke a conflict with them? And their regime, just like Xi, has many times expressed openness towards good relations with the United States.
Yeah, and as you said, because of the amount of nuclear weapons that these great powers have, and the likelihood that it would escalate quickly, I find it difficult to believe that any of these figures making policy still think that a nuclear war is winnable or could be limited. So to me, it seems like they're banking on the fact that they can make a new generation of nuclear weapons and just hope that they're never used. But we know, because of the research of experts that we've had on in the past, that there have been dozens of nuclear near misses. People see a blip on a radar screen, they think it's an incoming missile. And we were only minutes away from full-scale nuclear war. So I'm increasingly concerned about the possibility of an accident leading to general war.
Yeah, and in my book, The Russians Are Coming Again, I quoted from the head of Strategic Air Command during the Cold War, who after he retired said it was basically only by the grace of God and the miracle that nuclear weapons were never used. And there's also the environmental cost. Nuclear weapons are terrible. They cause horrendous effects in many communities, as far as affecting the water supply, and radiation poisoning for people who live or work on those facilities or around them. And they are, I think many people know how bad they are for the environment. So, and that's, the nuclear weapons are banned under international law now. The law came into effect this year, thanks to the work of groups like ICANN, which won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so it's illegal to produce nuclear weapons. And there's 50 universities in the United States that are involved in nuclear weapon production, disgracefully, and they should be outlawed. There's no purpose behind these weapons except destroying a huge part of humanity.
Yeah, and I want to start opening it up to audience questions, because I can just see in the chat that we have so many really, really insightful questions that are coming in. The first one touches on something that you just mentioned. Hold on, it was a bit earlier, from Tamara, who was talking about Mattis's confirmation hearing, where Senator Warren was asking if Mattis would ensure military research funding for universities right here in Massachusetts. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's almost a different conflict of interest. It's part of the military industrial academic
Mhm.
complex.
Yeah, well, I can refer the audience to an article we had on our website, Covert Action Magazine, on the University of Arkansas. And there, I think it's, in the subtitle is Red State Rebels, because it's about this peace group in Fayetteville who's trying to fight against the University of Arkansas's contract with Honeywell, which manufactures parts of nuclear weapons. And they're one of 50 universities that are involved in the production of nuclear weapons. And it's a betrayal of the university mission, which is to try and create a better world. And yeah, we see that everywhere. The University of Tulsa just hired the former Undersecretary of State and head of the major head of the Army. I forget the position, I have to double check, but he was very high in the military as their new president. They have all these programs with the Pentagon and cybersecurity. And that seems to be what's happening everywhere in universities. And they're getting all this funding from the Pentagon, and they're having students do research on military related projects, and they're suppressing critical thinking into the military, and they don't even teach many topics anymore. And I have a lot of experience with that because I worked in higher education. So it's sad. And universities are vital to functioning democracy and to vibrant debate and dissent. When a country goes too far into militarism, like the United States, the citizens have to mobilize against that and restore. I mean, we still have certain democratic features here that if more and more people stood up against us, they could make a huge difference. But people are increasingly not well informed on these issues, and they're suppressed in the media, increasingly in higher education. And these companies, in a bad economy, a lot of young people have nowhere else to work but these companies.
Well, we're all about that kind of resistance at Massachusetts Peace Action. I'm going to get to these other questions in the chat. There's some really good ones, but I actually want to turn the mic over to Donna, who's had her hand up for a while. Sorry to keep you waiting, Donna. You still have a question for us?
Yes, I do.
Here, let me put you up on the screen.
I didn't know that my little hand actually showed up. So I wasn't ready. Well, so I hear you saying peace, people are uninformed and all of this other stuff. It just sounds a little idealistic to think that. I guess I keep wanting to figure out how to work this system against itself. What strikes me is, you've said it several times, this is illegal. This is what they were supposed to do. I don't know why these liberal politicians have to be in the position that they're in, if we have laws. Okay, so that's number one. I don't understand why the laws are just not enforced. Okay, number two, I heard you say that, and I just want your feedback. Elizabeth Warren, that the reason she would cave on certain things, or any of those kinds of policies politicians would cave, is only because of money. And maybe I've seen too many movies where, we know that if somebody is not doing what the power elite want, they have other ways to get them to do it. That has nothing to do with money.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. I mean, I was on a radio show earlier this morning, and I was saying, pacifists don't last very long in American politics. So, and, look what happened. Kennedy started talking about peace with the Russians and gave a speech at American University, and a few months later, he's gone. Jimmy Carter talked nicely when he was running for office, but he ended up, huge military buildup, and they got rid of him anyways. So they have their ways to get rid of people.
You know about Scott Ritter? Do you know what they did with Scott Ritter?
Exactly. And Paul Wellstone was in a plane crash.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of, if you look at, there's a book about the crash that raised a lot of question marks. So yeah,
So, as
pacifists
far as
don't
Scott
last
Ritter
long.
goes, I heard from him himself. I became a groupie of his after, when he came and spoke to this peace activist group. And I heard it from his mouth, what happened. And they had a file on him that they were holding, and they waited until he was actually getting traction. He was on the Daily Show, and I said, uh-oh, he's in trouble. And sure enough, they released this file that they'd been holding on to for 2 years to discredit him. So I know that firsthand. So that's what I'm saying. I mean,
No, you're right. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's why, people like Sanders, I mean, he's good on a lot of issues, but then he'll compromise on some key issues because he knows what you're saying,
Yep.
and those who challenge, I mean, Henry Wallace, they have different ways. And, Henry Wallace was speaking for peace after World War II, and he was the vice president of the United States. And he called for huge reduction in the military budget and peace with Russia. And they made sure, that was the beginning of McCarthyism. They smeared him, and all his followers couldn't even get jobs anywhere. And so it's on and on. Yeah.
Thanks, Donna. I appreciate your comments. Next, Phil, I think, had his hand up next. Phil?
Yeah, I think in the situation involving Ukraine seems to me to be a very particular case that illustrates a very important danger that we're facing right now. Historically, back in 2014, we pulled off a coup there. The Russians pulled their tanks right up to the border and stopped them, clearly a defensive kind of move. And then in the next few years, Ukraine asked for military hardware, military support. And Obama said no. He said he gave them humanitarian aid, but no military support, fearing that it would lead to some kind of an escalation. Well, when Trump came in, apparently in 2017 and 18, they got millions of dollars for Raytheon built Javelin missiles. And then, as we learned in the impeachment hearings, the big issue was that Trump held up another $391 million of javelins that are meant to fight tanks. And so now we have a situation where Zelensky is saying, well, we're ready to go to war with Russia. We're ready to confront them. And so it just seems to me that all of this weaponry that was not necessary, and that by this big buildup that Raytheon pressed the United States government to fund, has now created a situation where the warmongers in Ukraine are ready to start taking action. It's like we created a situation with our funding where none existed. That's my
Yeah, I think it's a good point. The only correction I'd make is the Obama administration provided non-lethal aid, but it was actually stuff like spyware, and so it wasn't really humanitarian aid. And then Trump took it to the next level. But Biden, a big hawk was Biden. When he was vice president, he was pushing for the javelins back in right after the coup. And now he's in power. He's been a strong hawk on Russia and Ukraine. And that, I agree with you. It's a very dangerous situation, and it's a very rotten regime in Ukraine. As far as our taxpayer funding, very rotten regime that has been tied with fascist groups. And, the Ukrainian military does not want to fight their own people in the eastern Ukraine. That's why they're financing these private militias. And some of them are white supremacists, and they're committing a lot of atrocities in East Ukraine.
Well, I think my concern was that with Russia being a nuclear power and with Ukraine wanting to join or draw in NATO, this could lead to a big confrontation, kind of like World War I started off with a small confrontation and it became a world war.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I think you're right. It's very dangerous.
Thanks, Phil. Next, I want to call on Ruth, who I think has a question on another article that you wrote recently. Ruth.
Hi, thank you. This is so great. So thanks to both of you. And this may be something that already people know, and so I'm embarrassed if I should know and don't. But I believe there was an article about the fact that, Biden is talking about removing troops from Afghanistan, but that in truth, it's really, a shell game, that they're really converting over to mercenary troops and drones. Could you address that? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's very deceptive. Well, first, the US was supposed to have withdrawn on May the 1st, according to the deal they had. Unfortunately, the US government does not always follow its deal, its word of mouth. The Russians know that when the US promised they wouldn't expand NATO 1 inch to the east. And now NATO's all around Russia. But now they're saying we'll withdraw September, but the data shows that there's 7 mercenary for every US soldier in Afghanistan. There's 7 private military contractors, or mercenaries, a better name. The way they use language is very Orwellian, like Defense Department and private military contractor. It's really a mercenary, and there's 7 mercenaries for every 1 soldier. So you can withdraw that 1 soldier, but you still have 7 mercenaries. And they're providing $4 billion every year to the Afghan army. And they're going to keep trying to prop it up to keep this regime in Kabul that most Afghans view as just a puppet government. And yeah, they have air bases all around in Afghanistan and around the region from which they can carry drone attacks or air attacks to try and sustain this government that very few Afghans support. And as rivals, I think, the 2 of them, Ukraine and Afghanistan, rank as 2 of the most corrupt countries in the world as far as its governments. And the Afghan case, the government, though, only may control about 1/3 of the country. So it's possible the government would fall, although the US aid may be able to sustain it for a while. And that's the same strategy that was used in Vietnam in the waning years.
Thanks, Jeremy. Next, I want to call on Paul Shannon. Paul's one of the co-founders of the Raytheon anti-war campaign.
Thanks, Jeremy. You come out of a long, wonderful tradition at Covert Action Bulletin. Back in the 1970s and 80s, you just released so much important information about covert wars and all kinds of sleazy deals and everything else. So it's always been a great source for people that are trying to deal with U.S. policy, understanding it as well as possible. So thanks for your work there. I want to switch a little bit and get back to Austin himself. I don't know, I know you've mainly focused on military contracts under his tenure, but have you followed Austin in terms of his policies that he's advocating toward particular countries, Syria, Iraq? You've mentioned Taiwan and stuff, but even Taiwan, where is Austin himself coming from on a lot of these things? Where does he have a position? Has he said anything about Venezuela? Anything specific that you can tell us about where he's coming from on what policies he's pushing?
Okay, well, and maybe you know more. I do have some material on that in the article, because he was going around the world and shoring up U.S. military aid to all these governments. And for instance, in South Korea, he went to South Korea, and he was, they were promoting military exercises, and he said, "We're ready to fight tonight." He's taken a very hard line on North Korea, very hard line on China, very hard line on Iran. And that's what I have in the article. So that's what I found. Ukraine, yeah, he's spoken out about Ukraine. I think, let me find the comments in the article, what he said. He was taking, wonder if it's not cut off here, but I may be missing a page, but I know he made some comments about Ukraine, the standard rhetoric about Russian aggression. And I think he may have even hinted something about Crimea, supporting Ukraine's desire to retake Crimea. So he's taking very hawkish, extreme right-wing positions. And I would imagine, I don't know Venezuela, if he said anything, but because I know he's toured East Southeast Asia, he was in Afghanistan, and he was actually for Afghanistan. He claimed to want a responsible end to the war. So he seems to have been leery about Biden's policy of withdrawing by September. So he's really on the hawkish end on almost everything I've seen.
What is he must have some affinity to Biden, that Biden would appoint him Secretary of Defense. Do they have a history together?
It could be in Iraq because Biden was the key Obama administration point man on Iraq, and Austin was a key figure in the second Iraq war that Biden played an important role in escalating. So it's probably as a reward for his service in that war, but it's possible there's more of a personal connection that I think more research could be done. Whether that's the case, it's certainly a possibility.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I've just popped that quote from your article on Ukraine into the chat for people. I can read it. It's when fighting resumed in eastern Ukraine in early April, Austin assured Ukraine's defense minister Andriy Taran of the U.S. commitment to building the capacity of Ukraine's forces to defend more effectively against Russian aggression. Which was demonstrated by a recent $125 million military aid package. And then he said on Twitter that he reaffirmed the US's unwavering support for Ukrainian sovereignty, territorial integrity, and Euro-Atlantic aspirations. So, that flies in the face of our former promise not to extend NATO 1 inch to the east. I see another question in the chat. This is also from Tamara. Can Jeremy please talk about what he thinks about revolving door restrictions? And where can I find the website for defense contracts? I guess asking a little bit about where you got your source material.
Okay, if you give me a sec, I could find the website because I was actually just looking it up before this program to see what the last week or so, because I had been tracking it and writing this article. So I think I still have it on my web browser. If you give me a second.
Great, and we always send out a follow-up email as well. So if you share that link with us, we can send that out to everybody watching and everyone who registered.
All right. Well, I've got it here.
Great.
It up. So, yeah, it's defense.gov. I guess, what do you call that? It's under the it's like not a colon. It's I forget the term for that symbol. I'll write in the chat.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
Might be easier.
But they announce every day their contracts, and I'm just writing it down. So I'll write it in the chat.
Okay, great. There was another question in here that I wanted to make sure that we asked. It's from Pat Westwater Zhang. It was a really good question. I want to read it exact. Yes, this is back to U.S.-China relations. And she asked, can you please explain how this dynamic fits in with the fact that China has lent so much money to the U.S.? It's our economies seem to be incredibly linked with one another. So how does that make sense? Our economies are linked.
Well, that's a good question. And I think it gets to the point is that the system has become totally irrational. Like the public policy is completely irrational when you have these huge corporations that basically dominate in the way they do and hold sway in the way they do. Government policy follows their dictates and doesn't follow any rational policy that's even not only is it immoral and threatening war, but it's so paradoxical. And it reminds me, and ultimately self-destructive. And all empires self-destruct throughout history, and I think we're seeing the decay of the American empire at this time. And we're at that kind of phase of just pure decadence. And we've seen that in the Trump era and the Clinton era, these complete corruption of government leaders. And it reminds me of the situation in Afghanistan, because for years the US was funding Pakistan. And I think Joe Biden was a strong supporter of ratcheting up military aid over the years to Pakistan, who's financing the Taliban. So how does that make sense, to be fighting in Afghanistan for 20 years when you're also financing your own enemy and assassins? And it's completely self-destructive. And the US has drained its treasury in Afghanistan like other empires. And look at the conditions now in the United States. You see growing third world conditions with a huge homeless population and homeless encampments in major cities. Not a first world country. In fact, you'll find better conditions in third world countries where they can at least find lodging for people. So
Did you have a
that's my
follow-up?
answer, but it's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a great question.
We have time to pursue it, but I'd be curious in reading what you might write about this. It just seems so completely illogical, and I can't
Yeah.
quite fit the whole pieces together. They loan us so much money, we owe them so much money, so we're in that position, and yet we're trying to start this we have this competition, and there are all the other negative parts of this relationship. So I don't understand how they weave together and how one impacts the other. Doesn't make sense. I'd like to hear more about that at some point, but I also wanted to know what if there are any suggestions you have. You may not be possible to put that out here this evening, but what a mess we are in. And but here, peace action, and you are trying to do so much, trying to make it better. So do you have any suggestions for ways forward, how we might be able to unweave these things, get the truth out, and make some sense in what we're doing?
Yeah, well, I think the work that you guys are doing is great. I mean, I think just, if there's a way to recruit more people to your group, to organization like yours, we have a small group in Tulsa. There's a good, vibrant peace group in Fayetteville, Arkansas, that was leading this campaign against the university's ties with nuclear weapons. There's a guy I'm in contact with in Houston who's trying to get people, at people's houses to do like teach-ins, just like a block party. So I think any ideas like that are good, just to engage with people. Yeah, because people are so isolated, especially in the COVID era, and they're stuck on their screens. And I mean, although the human contact is less, and people aren't interacting as much. And I mean, some good information is available on the internet, but you have to know where to look for, and most people may not. And there's still, the dominant media still influences people's perception. So I think any grassroots, traditional methods of grassroots organizing to recruit new members and get more people involved in these progressive groups like yours. And to target these corporations, I think, as the right approach, because that they corrupt the political system, and they're the ones that have to be reined in. And the idea of reconversion, I think, is a good one that peace groups can promote on a local level, and try and ally with businessmen or scientists, because there are scientists, as you've experienced, or whether they're students who want to use their talents to benefit humankind, whether it's, as you say, fighting disease or dealing with environmental problems, or building infrastructure. So to work with students or young engineers who want to have a positive difference in their career and work for reconversion. Yeah, there's a good book by Seymour Melman that was written in the 80s when this movement was still going forward from the Vietnam era. He had written about it. Some of you may have heard of Seymour Melman. He was an economist. He wrote a book called Pentagon Capitalism. And then he wrote a book that was kind of a blueprint for a program of reconversion. And he had worked with some prominent political figures, including he had the support of the Speaker of the House, Jim Wright from Texas. But then they ruined Wright. They spread rumors about him. And he was charged with some minor petty offense, and they got him out of his position. But, he had forged some contacts with politicians who did, support this movement. So, I mean, I think there are some politicians, they may be at the state assembly level, that are good to forge relations and contacts with. So I think those are just some ideas. Others have as good ideas as that.
Well, if I could just briefly say, I'm in the 3rd Congressional District in Massachusetts, and we have both Raytheon headquarters here, and we have Fort Devens. And at Fort Devens, they were going to sell that land to corporations or whatever, but due to citizen action in surrounding towns, they were able to take half of Fort Devens and turn it into affordable housing and all kinds of other good things. So, and that was citizen actions. So perhaps there's some way that map.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's where it starts, and these movements grow.
Thanks.
And I think education is important as well. Those who are teachers, to educate younger people about this and get them involved.
Thanks, Pat. Those are some great questions. Next, I want to turn it over to Cole. I see you have your hand up, Cole.
Yeah. Jeremy, thanks for coming on. We really appreciate this talk. There are 2 theories in the peace movement about why the US spends so much on its military. One is that it's sort of an institutionalized rake-off, that the military companies are so big that they can bribe Congress, they can set policy to their liking, and it's a self-perpetuating cycle. It's like an institutional corruption. The other theory is that the US has an empire and that it actually needs to defend that empire, and that when countries want to leave, they have to be controlled, so that there's actually a reason to have military bases all over the world and powerful forces to confront any adversary. How do you see the relationship between these 2 theories? Which one do you think has more truth in it?
Well, I mean, I think they're both true, and they work together, because the institutionalized, corruption, or the system you're describing of huge corporations dominating the political structure, is what drives forward the U.S. overseas empire. And then, these companies are profiting massively off the military base structure and the wars in different ways. And then there becomes a need to sustain that empire. The empire was set up, I mean, really it coalesced after World War II. And, it went back to the late 19th century with the colonization of the Philippines and the establishment of Guantanamo Bay. And so, once you've established that empire, you want to expand it and protect it. And it could be framed as a benevolent empire, but if you talk to the people who live under the boot of the empire, they may say otherwise. Whether it's the people in Okinawa who had all their best land taken up by these bases, or it's people in Iraq who lived under the bombs, or Kosovo. There are many victims of that empire, but its claim, is an empire for good that spreads certain ideals of democracy and has to stand up to Russia and China, who would spread authoritarianism if they grow stronger. And that's the kind of justifying ideology of the empire that sustains it. And the media, perpetuates that idea, and most educational institutions as well, increasingly. So a lot of the public may be conditioned to support the empire. But I think the 2 theories go off each other. And they're both true.
I think they do, but I think there's areas where they disagree. Like the first theory would predict that, like it doesn't really matter whether the weapons work, they just need to be expensive. Whereas the second one actually wants the weapons to work and be effective in military strategy. So, some of the criticism of the F-35 and the plane that doesn't fly and stuff would fit more into the first theory, that they can get away with building this colossal program and it doesn't even need to do any good in a military sense.
Yeah, well, we do see, like with the question about China and the debt, and what I was saying about Afghanistan, I mean, there is increasingly irrational policies that are counterproductive to American interests. And so that would indicate that these, domestic forces have grown so strong that they completely pervert U.S. foreign policy and becomes totally irrational. And I think we have seen that to a certain extent. But I mean, yeah, some government officials will, of course, want to make the empire function more smoothly. And that's, one reason I think Biden, the pro-imperialists were certainly supporting Biden, because Trump was an embarrassment to the United States and brought such a terrible image for the United States. They had to get in somebody like Biden who would restore some better image for the U.S. abroad before the empire collapsed, thinking maybe he could help sustain it.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, it reminds me of a line from to attempt to answer this question from Cole. It reminds me of a line that Matt Taibbi used when he was beginning to understand the financial collapse in 2008. One of the officials he talked to said, you have to look at it like a crime story for it to make sense, right? It doesn't make sense. I mean, you can't, if we went to nuclear war, it would destroy everything. But it's not supposed to make sense. It's supposed to make money. So I often, maybe this is a bit cynical, but I often look at our extreme military spending as just a way for these contractors to rob massive amounts of money while it's on its way from the Capitol building to the Pentagon. But maybe that's too simplistic. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Tamara, who's asked a lot of really great questions in the chat. So take the floor.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tamara Lawrence. I'm with the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom Canada chapter, and I'm in Waterloo, Ontario. Thank you very much for hosting this event, and thank you, Jeremy, for your presentation. I have been doing some research into the revolving door in the military complex, in military industrial complex, both in the United States and in Canada, and kind of comparing and contrasting the restrictions. And we have more restrictions on the revolving door, longer cooling off periods post-employment, better transparency and accountability, things like a better public database. I mean, we still have, some problems, absolutely. But I was wondering if Jeremy could talk a little bit about his thoughts about the revolving door restrictions, post-employment, cooling off periods, etc. And then Jeremy, I think that you were referring to, and I just wanted to make a plug for it because I think it's still so relevant today, that excellent book by Seymour Melman written in 1988 called The Demilitarized Society, Disarmament and Conversion. It's a little book. It's so excellent. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, that's the book. Exactly. Yeah, it's a great book and it has so much relevance to today. And as far as the revolving door, I mean, well, I don't know, I'm not an expert on it, but I think the Austin case is very blatant that, these, military figures are going from the military to the large corporations to back into the government. And there are very few limitations. And, it seems that they're less and less because the, Secretary of Defense traditionally were civilians until Mattis and now Austin. So, obviously the revolving door has just gotten worse and worse and worse, and the profits higher and higher and higher. So, there's an urgent need to fight against that. And then, you have the revolving door with the media. Increasingly, even liberal outlets have, like John Brennan is a MSNBC guest and commentator. And so even the liberal outlets are featuring CIA and military generals. And that's another feature of the revolving door. And they can really condition public opinion, especially liberal opinion. I think they've gotten more savvy at that because I read an article about public attitude towards Russia, And like in 2000, the majority of the US public had a good impression of Russia and wanted good relations. And today it stands at like 20%. And it found that the people who have the heart, who are supportive of the most aggressive policy and have the worst attitudes towards Russia are Democrats, because MSNBC and CNN, which attract more liberal audience, were promoting this anti-Russia narrative for years, especially in the Trump presidency. And they wanted to link Trump to Russia and alleged treason. So that's, I think, a key feature of the revolving door. And I don't know how that is in Canada, if it's as nearly as bad, but it's really bad here, the revolving door with the media.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I just want to highlight as maybe a step that people can take that really ties together a lot of these issues that we're talking about tonight is where we're doing an action on tax day, which is just 10 days from now on May the 17th. And I'll put the link in the chat as well. Ours that we're holding is going to be in Boston, right next to the Boston Garden at the Tip O'Neill Federal Building. But this is an effort that it's not just peace action, it's not just peace activists. We have unions coming. The Massachusetts AFL-CIO is supporting it, the Boston Teachers Union, the Massachusetts Teachers Association,
509 service workers.
Yeah, the SEIU, the service workers that go door to door, really taking care of the elderly in their homes. I mean, you want to talk about essential workers over the past year. SEIU, that's a group of people that should have our utmost respect. So it's people from all over the progressive spectrum fighting for different issues, who are frustrated with where our tax money is going. And we see the link between the people who are making policy and military contractors, people who depend on the Pentagon budget getting bigger and bigger year after year, despite the fact that it's not what the people in this country want. It's not what we need to keep our people safe, right? You can't nuke a hurricane or a pandemic virus. Our insane military budget didn't protect 500,000 Americans from losing their lives to COVID-19. So this is really about changing priorities. So we encourage everyone to join in on our action on the 17th. Click that link and you can find out more information. We're going to have lots of great speakers, including, representatives of our state government, like you were talking about, Jeremy, that we're trying to form a closer relationship with, veterans, climate groups. The local Sunrise group is going to be there as well. It'll be a great event, and we're also encouraging other people around the country and in different parts of the state to put on their own tax day events and really demand that this country change its priorities from benefiting just a few defense contractors with over half of our discretionary spending, and taking that money and reinvesting it in things that the people actually want, like education and healthcare and infrastructure. So we're not, so we don't have an infrastructure that's getting a C rating or below in the richest country in the world. Sorry, that was my little sermon that I gave, but I always like to point people. That's the action part of our name here at Peace Action. We always want to point people in the direction of something they can get involved with. Jeremy, you're out in Oklahoma. Can you tell us a little bit more about the groups that are you mentioned a peace group out there in Tulsa. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's going on in the ground in Oklahoma?
Yeah, well, there is a Tulsa Peace Fellowship, which has been around for a long time. Unfortunately, I think the COVID has really slowed things down. There weren't many meetings, and we were holding a lot of educational events, lectures and libraries, and there were some protests. We had just small little protests over. The last one was over the bombing and the drone attack on Soleimani in Iran. That was before the COVID, so it was attracting actually pretty big numbers. But yeah, the COVID period has slowed things down. But yeah, there are peace groups in this region, and there's a group in Fayetteville, Arkansas, that's very strong, and they've established connections with other cities. So Oklahoma is really in the belly of the beast. I mean, the oil industry dominates, and they're always very hawkish, and the military, I think, is the biggest employer in the state, along with the oil industry. And you have Senator James Inhofe, who supported every war. And actually, with Raytheon, he had stocks in Raytheon. The week, and it was actually reported in the Tulsa World, he sold stocks and made I think $800,000 while he was voting to sustain the war in Yemen. And the Senate actually at that point voted against it, but the two Oklahoma senators, Inhofe and Langford, voted for it to keep the war in Yemen. And then it turned out that he had sold Raytheon stocks just that week and made like $800,000, and they still voted him back in. The Oklahoma voter is so, I don't know, like, how more blatantly corrupt can you be? And it's supposed to be the Bible Belt, all these churches. I mean, what kind of value? It's a genocide in Yemen, and your senator is making money off the killing of children, and it's horrified people around the world. And they're purporting to be these Christian moralists, and he's making money off that. It's just sick. I mean, if you ask me. But
yeah, and I believe
that's the
he was
situation in Oklahoma. I mean,
I believe he was the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee at the time too. I know he's still ranking member.
Yeah, and he's always supporting every war and every increase in military. And all he does is goes around and how great the U.S. military intervention, and they keep voting him in. He's practically 90 years old himself. He's like 88 years old, and he's been in office for like 35 years. And it's sad. I mean, but only like 30% of Oklahomans vote, and then the school system is really bad, and it's a more authoritarian environment. They don't even want these issues brought up, let alone debated.
Okay, so I know that it's getting late. It's Friday night, so I just want to leave people with a couple of more things that you can do. I'm going to put an action in the chat right now. We set this up after Joe Biden made an announcement in February. He said he was going to keep his campaign promise and end the war in Yemen. This is particularly relevant to us. It's one of the issues we focused on with the Raytheon anti-war campaign, to try and localize that war that's happening on the other side of the world, but is so linked to an institution right here in Massachusetts, Raytheon Technologies. And so when Biden made his announcement, we saw it as a step in the right direction. We were going to stop supporting offensive operations by Saudi Arabia in Yemen. But we were worried that we wanted to make sure that he would follow through on that promise. And to be honest, we just haven't seen it yet. His special envoy was before Congress just in the last 2 weeks. He was unable to answer direct questions by members of Congress. Have you carried through on this promise from Joe Biden? Have you stopped offensive operations in Yemen? Stop supporting them, Saudi operations? And he was unable to answer it. And as we have heard from experts in the movement, Yemeni American health officials, the bombings have continued every day of the Biden administration. So despite the fact that they are saying the right things, we need to push. We need more pressure on Joe Biden and on Congress to end the war in Yemen, which cannot continue without direct U.S. support. The weapons, the planes, they're made here in the United States and by Western allies as well. We're not going to stop until the bombings stop. A press conference is not enough for us. So we also have a couple of actions that are coming up. One organized by Louise Coleman, who's on the call tonight. I'll put the link in the chat. We're going to be doing a stand out and speak out in Sherborne, Massachusetts, and I believe that's on the Sunday, the 16th of May. And then on the 29th of May, we're going to be doing a readathon at Faneuil Hall by the Sam Adams statue. A good place to do it, where folks are going to be reading poetry and anti-war articles, and we're going to have music as well. Just to raise awareness and gain more support for ending the war in Yemen. But I will put those links in the chat, and we hope that people can join. And I'm definitely going to reach out to the Tulsa Peace Fellowship and what was that group in Fayetteville that you were talking?
Yeah, I'll give you there's a guy named Dick Bennett, and he has a newsletter, and Omni is the group, and it's a really great group of people. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we'll stay in touch, because that's one good thing about, the one silver lining to all of this is that the digital organizing, we're able to stay in contact with people from across the country and really from across the world and try and build power to challenge this establishment. But Jeremy, I want to give you the last word. Can you tell us, what's coming down the pipe from Covert Action Magazine? How can we, find more of your work, support your work?
We're at covertactionmagazine.com. And we've got a lot of good articles. We're also looking for new writers. So if anyone here wants to write an article for us, whether it's about, peace action that's going on here, in Massachusetts or on these other world events, that would be great. So we have some good articles coming out. We have one on education next week. It's called genocide denial in U.S. schools, because they only teach about the Holocaust, the Nazis, which points out. It's good that should be continue to teach that. It's really important, but that shouldn't be the only genocide. What about all the genocide with the U.S. government? In Indonesia and Guatemala and on and on. And if you're not teaching students that, they don't really have any understanding of the world and, a proper understanding of world affairs and their own country's role and often abetting genocide. So it's written by a teacher who, is trying to change the curriculum in his school to include other genocides and promote more critical view of U.S. foreign policy among young people, so they'll work for change. If they don't know what's going on, they can't work for change. So that's just one. We have an article on Honduras because there's an election coming up, and the U.S. has really made a mess of that country after the coup of 2009, and it's a really bad situation. We try and cover different conflicts around the world and cast critical attention on U.S. policy.
Well, we will definitely look forward to that article, especially that one on genocide. I'm going to put the link to Covert Action Magazine right there in the chat. But
we can through Brian, we could send articles to Covert.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be great. We're looking for new writers. So I can, Brian can, for some reason, I'm having trouble in the chat because she was asking about the defense contractors website. That is the right website. I couldn't respond yes. So if Brian could give my email, you could email me the article directly. And, I work with the writer to fine tune the piece.
Fantastic. Well, let
And
me.
yeah, we would love, we had one article on Yemen, but we would like more on that conflict. And how, yeah, Biden's not sticking by his promise. That would be a great article. Brian's doing an article on Raytheon. So
Well, hopefully this is just the first time of many that we're going to be talking to you, because I know that everything you listed. I mean, even Honduras, we have a Latin America working group too that gets into U.S. intervention in Central and South America and the Caribbean countries as well. I just popped Jeremy's email in the chat, so thanks for sharing that. And I'm going to send out all this information in a follow-up email as well, including, Pat, of course, we have an Israel and Palestine group as well. There's lots of ways to get involved with Mass Peace Action. We work on the full gamut of peace issues. You can get in touch with me at brian@masspeaceaction.org. I'll put that in the chat as well. But it was really great to be in conversation with you, Jeremy, and we had so many amazing questions and comments from our audience too. So really hope to do this again and do it again soon. But thank you so much for being generous with your time on a Friday night here. And let's keep in touch. The only way that we're going to turn this around is if we do it together. So we really appreciate it, and keep an eye on your inboxes. We will be sending out the recording, and really want to ask that you just share that recording with your network, with your friends and family who couldn't be with us live. And go on our YouTube page. That's where the link will take you, and subscribe. It actually really does help us get the word out. And also consider becoming a member of Massachusetts Peace Action. Or one of the Peace Action affiliates if you're in a different state, or whatever your local peace group is. It might be Tulsa Peace Fellowship or the group out in Fayetteville, Arkansas. We're all working towards the same goal. And I see someone's listening in from New York. We got a Peace Action New York State. I'm sure they'd love to have you. So thanks for making the connection, and we'll talk again soon, Jeremy.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, and it's great meeting you all, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
All right. Happy Friday, everyone. Have a good night. We'll talk soon.
Thanks. Take care.
So much. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.
Peace.
Peace.
Yeah.